Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, October 24th, 2025, and our friend, Ambassador Chas Freeman, joins us. Welcome back, Ambassador.
I'm glad to be with you, Nima.
I want to start, Ambassador, with the growing differences between Washington and Israel. It seems that the basis and the main problem between the two administrations is the annexation of the West Bank. And we had J.D. Vance going to Israel. When he was there, they were talking in the Knesset, they were talking about the annexation. They voted for that. And here is the reaction of J.D. Vance about the annexation of the West Bank, the voting in Israel.
The West Bank vote yesterday that took place while you were in the country?
Oh, yeah, that was weird. That was weird. I was sort of confused by that. Now, I actually asked somebody about it, and they told me that it was a symbolic vote, some symbolic vote to recognize or a symbolic vote to annex the West Bank. I mean, what I would say to that is when I asked about it, somebody told me that it was a political stunt, that it had no practical significance. It was purely symbolic. I mean, look, if it was a political stunt, it was a very stupid political stunt, and I personally take some insult to it. The West Bank is not going to be annexed by Israel. The policy of the Trump administration is that the West Bank will not be annexed by Israel. That will continue to be our policy. And if people want to take symbolic votes, they can do that. But we certainly weren't happy about it. Thank you.
It doesn't seem that's the case in the mind of Netanyahu and his administration. Your take, Ambassador.
Well, I think there are several dimensions to this. One is that this was a vote against Netanyahu's acquiescence in Trump's so-called ceasefire peace program. This was a defiant act against Netanyahu. It was also an insult, as J.D. Vance realized, to the United States and to the Trump administration. And so it wasn't simply symbolic. In the Knesset, I understand, you have to have 3 votes in order to pass legislation. This was the first. And interestingly, one of the Likud party members, Netanyahu's party, broke ranks with the party, which voted against the resolution, and he voted for it. And so it passed. And this is therefore yet another indication of how divided Israelis are. And it's also an indication of how little attention they pay to the United States or American policy. They just do whatever they think they can get away with. I don't think they can get away with annexing the West Bank. But of course, there is a lot of violence by the settlers now going on in the West Bank. De facto, it is being annexed, whatever the law says. So there is that. And in the meantime, the fact that Israel is violating the ceasefire agreement in Gaza in multiple ways, withholding food and medical supplies, killing people, means that there's a distraction from the West Bank. So people are not really as closely following the West Bank as closely as they should. I guess the final point is Netanyahu didn't want a ceasefire. Nobody in Israel wanted a ceasefire. What they wanted was the hostages back. They got the hostages back. Now they're determined to break the ceasefire. They always break ceasefires. There is no agreement on a peace plan. This is no peace plan. It is simply a ceasefire. And unfortunately, Donald Trump seems to not understand that an end to fighting of a temporary nature, or even a longer-term end to fighting, is not a peace. A peace involves settling the underlying issues that cause the conflict. And there's no provision in the so-called peace plan to do that. And neither Israel nor the Palestinians have signed on to anything other than the ceasefire, the exchange of hostages that is occurring.
Netanyahu says that they always say that about the annexation, that they cannot because Donald Trump himself came out and said he's not going to let Israel to annex again and again to annex the West Bank. But Netanyahu doesn't feel that way. He says that we are an independent nation. Is Israel an independent nation without help these sort of military aid? They're sending a lot of money to Israel to help their economy, because the Israeli economy is on the brink of collapse. If you look at what has happened during the last 2 years, and if it wasn't because of the United States and the support coming from the United States, what would have happened to Israel so far if they're independent?
I think Prime Minister Netanyahu was reacting to a comment by Steve Bannon to the effect that Israel is an American protectorate, which is an accurate description. Israel could not survive without the support of the United States. Netanyahu has made a career out of extracting that support from the United States very successfully. But even he now recognizes that the basis for American support of Israel has badly eroded. First, he transformed the issue from a bipartisan issue, the question of US-Israel relations, it was always bipartisan, into a partisan issue in which Democrats opposed more and more Israeli policies, while Republicans adhered to them and supported them. So this is now a partisan issue in the United States. Very few Democrats agree that Israel should receive the support that it does, given its behavior. Even many Republicans are questioning that aid. There is a faction in the Republican Party which argues for restraint in foreign policy and wants to cut back American military commitments. And they do not like what is happening with Israel. There's another group who are patriots who dislike the humiliation of the United States that Netanyahu routinely administers. After all, he's intervened directly in American politics on multiple occasions. He goes behind the president to the Congress whenever he wishes, and he never follows the directions that he gets from the United States. So he's probably thinking on the basis of historical precedent that whatever the United States says, he can outflank that and go ahead with his annexation of the West Bank. And as I said, in practical terms, it's being annexed by the settlers as we speak, law or no law in the Knesset.
Yeah, it seems that we have some sort of problem in the connection. I don't know what's that, but Ambassador, when you look at Israel today earlier I was talking with Colonel Wilkerson and Larry Johnson. They had different, takes on what's going on with the Netanyahu administration. Do you think the situation that is happening right now, the differences between Washington and Israel and Tel Aviv, is somehow bringing more desperation to Netanyahu and his administration, which could lead to escalations, I don't know, in the region? Maybe they're trying to do some sort of false flag operation, or they attack in Iran, the new attacks in Iran. What is, in your opinion, the exit? What do we know from the behavior of Netanyahu, what we've seen so far? What is their strategy, if you were to mention that?
I think Netanyahu's strategy is to survive in office so that he doesn't go to jail. And that is his obsession. And he's now very much in danger. You could say that this vote to annex the West Bank was a symbolic vote of no confidence in Netanyahu. One of his own party members broke ranks. He doesn't have the support in the Knesset of a majority. the religious or the ultra-Orthodox parties have withdrawn from his coalition. So he's in trouble politically at home. Typically, when that happens, he finds some way to distract attention from it. That makes an attack on Iran more likely. But on the other hand, I don't think there's any appetite in Washington to support him. He's a very difficult customer. President Trump is a very prideful man, and he is aware that Netanyahu has repeatedly denigrated him, saying that Netanyahu, controls Trump, and not to worry.
Yeah, I don't know what is the problem, but I tried to switch the cable here to see if the internet connection is getting better.
Can you not hear me, or?
Yeah, no, it's right now. It seems that stable right now.
Okay.
But yeah,
maybe there's trouble in Brazil.
Yeah, it seems. Yeah, I don't know what's that. Yeah. Ambassador, when you look at the situation with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, they're talking about the yellow line, dividing Gaza in two zones. Is that going to help after all the administration
No,
if they really want you to find a permanent solution?
No, it's absolutely absurd. First of all, it's neo-colonial. There's no authority for Israel to do that. In fact, it's grossly against international law. Israel cannot do that legally. The United States cannot do that legally. This is all the part of the real estate deal mentality that has afflicted the Palestinians in Gaza. Meanwhile, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Israel is not delivering the aid that was promised. The International Court of Justice ruled that Israel has an obligation to provide aid through the United Nations, which is to say, through the UN Relief Works Agency, UNRWA. Israel is refusing to deal with UNRWA, and Marco Rubio endorsed the Israeli position that UNRWA is an agent of Hamas, which is absurd. It is a UN agency. So there are multiple violations of the ceasefire agreement, multiple violations of international law going on. And to talk about dividing Gaza arbitrarily along some yellow line that is certainly a provocation rather than a solution. I'd like to make a point here, and that is Israel is in grave danger of exporting its Palestinian problem. If you remember, in the 1960s, Palestinians in exile carried out a whole series of terrorist attacks, not just on Israelis, but on people who supported Israel, Jews and others who were prominent in supporting Israel. I think if Israel were successful in expelling Hamas from Gaza, which I don't think it will be, because I don't think you can gain at the negotiating table what you have failed to gain on the battlefield. Israel spent 2 years trying to dislodge Hamas from Gaza, and it has failed. And it is not going to persuade Gaza to commit suicide, or Hamas to commit suicide. So Israel is in danger that if it expels the Palestinians, as it once expelled the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, from Beirut, it will find that it has an external problem, that the attacks on Israel, on Israelis, occur outside Israel. And I think much of the world, certainly much of the Muslim world, would applaud that, not oppose it. So Israel is creating a problem for the world's Jews, many of whom don't want anything to do with Israel, but who are being tarred with the brush of Israeli crimes. So this is really there's nothing good to be said about what is happening at the moment. And Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are Zionists, and they are part of the problem.
I think one of the main issues with the case of Israel is that they don't see themselves in a big problem. Israelis, the government, and they don't see themselves. But it's totally the opposite when it comes to the the people in Washington. They see a lot of problem with what Israel is dealing with, and they see Israel in huge problem. That is not the case for Israelis. What is that? Why is that?
Well, Israel has manufactured an information bubble, and it lives in it. Any criticism of Israel is instantly dismissed as anti-Semitic, even though it may have absolutely nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Equating anti-Zionist criticism with anti-Semitism is the Israeli strategy. It's worked. It's now not working. Israelis in Israel, some of them are aware of that. Most aren't. They're still living in a bubble in which they are the eternal victims. Everything they do to other people is justified. The Palestinians are terrorists. Israel, of course, is a terrorist state. It rules by terror, but it doesn't perceive itself as doing that. Abroad, among supporters of Israel, especially Jewish supporters of Israel, there has also been a ban on criticism of Israel, because if you criticize Israel, you are immediately condemned as anti-Semitic, which nobody in the West wants to be called anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism is a horror that none of us want to be associated with. So this silences people, and it enables the supporters of Israel to live in a bubble in which they are never contradicted. They say ridiculous things, absolutely absurd things, and you've seen this with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. By Leslie Stahl in an interview, whether there was genocide in Gaza, they both said, oh, no, there's no genocide. But every human rights organization in the world that has looked at this has concluded there is genocide. The UN has concluded there is genocide. Court proceedings at the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have concluded that this is genocide. So how can they maintain denial? They can do it because any criticism of Israel in their presence is ruled out of order. They don't hear it. So they don't have an accurate view of what's going on, either in terms of the loss of support for Israel among ordinary Americans or among Jews. These are Jews of great wealth who are not, the ordinary Jewish population in New York City demonstrates for Palestinian rights. I admire them. They are willing to put up with the kind of slander that thunders forth from apologists for Israel, and it's their own community. I admire them, and I think they deserve respect. But I doubt that Jared Kushner or Steve Witkoff have any idea about what's going on at that level.
It seems that there is a gap or some sort of division within the Jews in the United States, and a faction of Jews in the United States who are wealthy and they have the most power. They're mostly Zionist, and the other, the majority of the Jews in the United States who don't have that sort of voice to be heard. But after all, what we see, the outcome would be these Zionists who are so powerful in the United States in supporting Israel. Do you think, in the mind of these people, these wealthy, powerful people in the system in the United States who are mostly Zionists, do they really believe that they're helping Israel with this sort of attitude?
Well, I suppose they do believe it. Look at Miriam Adelson. She and her husband financed a free newspaper, Israel Hayom, Israel Today, to praise Netanyahu and boost his career. Netanyahu has not been good for Israel. Most Israelis would agree with that statement. I think American Jews would strongly agree that he has been very bad for Israel. But he has been kept in power by precisely the wealthy Jewish oligarchs that you mentioned. There's another problem here, and that is that long before our press in the United States consolidated and became essentially scribes for the government narrative, there was self-censorship on the issue of Israel. I remember very well, I was in Dubai, I believe, many years ago, and there was, on the evening news in Arabic, there was a homemade movie clip from Gaza, which showed a kid being hauled out of his home by two plainclothes Israeli agents who kicked him in the head and beat him up and then shot him in the head and walked away laughing. And I thought to myself, when this hits the press in the United States, all hell is going to break loose. But of course, it never appeared. It did appear the next day in the form of frames on the back of the Khalij Times, which is an English language newspaper in the UAE. But it never appeared in the United States. And it was quite clear that there was self-censorship going on. And again, enforcing the idea that you can't criticize Israel because if you do, you're anti-Semitic, which is nonsense.
I think right now, with the case of Hamas, Ambassador, they're thinking what would be the path forward for them. Even they were talking about, somehow changing Hamas to be some sort of national army for Palestinians, for Gazans. And do you think that would be a solution that would be somehow that would resonate with the Trump administration, with the people?
No, not at all. The greatest criminal act of all in this handling of this issue by the United States is the total absence of any consultations with any Palestinian, not just Hamas. Of course, the Trump administration did meet with Hamas on the hostage issue and found them quite reasonable. But they didn't even consult with the Palestinian Authority, headed by Mahmoud Abbas, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Israel and the United States. It is basically the contractor that enforces security for Israelis in the West Bank. And so they didn't consult with anybody. And the odd thing here is Hamas for years has said that it was prepared to withdraw from politics, to turn over the government to a government of national unity, in which it might play a very minor role, but not a leading role. It has been very modest. There is no unity among Palestinians, which is the result of deliberate Israeli policies, not just policies aimed at splitting Palestinians politically, arming gangs in Gaza. Let us remember where Hamas came from. It was elected as the government of Palestine in 2006. It came to power through the ballot box in a free election, which was fair. Everyone who observed it thought it was a model of election. The United States and Israel immediately began an effort to overthrow it. And that effort succeeded in the West Bank and failed in Gaza. And then Israel has taken advantage of the division between those two Palestinian factions But what we're seeing now is there's a process which was actually begun by the Chinese in Beijing of uniting Palestinian factions to form a national government. That process is now resumed in Cairo. Interestingly, the Palestinian Authority is not meeting with the other Palestinians. It is meeting with the Egyptian intelligence and security people. So Palestine needs a national government. That's something only Palestinians can arrange. If the West thinks, if the United States and Israel believe that Gaza can be governed by Tony Blair and a bunch of neo-colonial Europeans, or that it can be policed by the Gulf Arabs, that they are willing to come in and protect Israel from Palestinian self-determination, which is essentially the mission they're being assigned. And Indonesia has, said it would send troops, but not for that purpose. I think they're dreaming. I think it's totally unrealistic. This ceasefire isn't going to last, and there has been no progress at all toward peace. There can be no peace until Palestine is given the self-determination that Israelis have demanded for themselves and that Palestinians also deserve.
Yeah. I think the main concern is right now when we look at the situation in Ukraine and the talks that Donald Trump had with Vladimir Putin in Alaska, and there is no hope for the deal between Palestinian and Israel. And I don't know how long does it take to to everything falling apart before our eyes.
Well, in both cases, Palestine, Israel, Palestine, and Russia, Ukraine, or NATO, Russia, Ukraine, Donald Trump has made the same mistake. He has not addressed the causes of the conflict. He's called for a ceasefire, but a ceasefire which would freeze the conflict is not a solution to anything. And it is absolutely not acceptable to either party in the war in Ukraine or to either party in the conflict in Palestine. So until American diplomacy addresses the root causes of these conflicts, they're going to continue. And the United States is, in keeping its company with Israel, is destroying our own reputation internationally. So this is doing huge damage to the United States and its national interests. Not to mention temper tantrums, President Trump ending trade talks with Canada, our second largest trading partner after Mexico. And Canada has basically decided to write off the United States. Its whole orientation is changing. The Port of Montreal is being modernized at great expense because Canada expects to reorient itself toward Europe. And it will also reorient itself toward Asia. And I predict at some point, Canada will rediscover the merits of cooperating with the Chinese. So what we are doing is creating enemies where none existed, and joining Israel in the reputation for being lawless, capricious, arbitrary, and inhumane. So this is all to be deplored.
I think none of the issues, considering the foreign policy of the United States, has hit the Democrats the way that the issue of Palestine did in the election that they had Kamala Harris against Donald Trump. One of the main issues on the Democratic Party was the case of Palestine and Gaza. It seems that the same is happening within the Republican Party. And after all, when you join these two, in the Democrats call it the far left and the left part of the party. And within the Republican Party, you see new factions who are not totally in line with the US foreign policy in Gaza, in Palestine. These people are questioning what's going on, why Israel is so much, they do have a lot of leverage on us. What is that? They're asking this question. Do you think as time goes by, this gap, this sort of, you know, this connection between the elites and the people would somehow widen the gap, or it's
I think
gonna?
it is. I think it is widening, and there's no reason not to expect it to continue to widen. I would say of the Democrats, you're in Brazil, and the United States is now basically behaving like a pirate group in the Caribbean, killing Trinidadians and Venezuelans and Colombians, both in the Caribbean and now in the Pacific. And I think one has to recognize that the Democrats are responsible for this, ultimately. Obama began to kill people overseas. On Tuesdays, he would have a meeting and there would be a kill list and he would approve it. And he even killed Americans in Yemen. So the precedent of unilateral executive murder was set in the Obama administration. It is not an invention of the Republicans. They have simply built on it. It is absolutely outrageous. And it means that the United States is now increasingly regarded by the world as an outlaw government. And that is not a way to rally support in the event of a crisis, whether the crisis is economic, political, or military.
I think one of the issues right now with Ukraine is the attitude of the U.S. government. They said that they're going to have a meeting between Donald Trump and Putin. Then it was reduced to the meeting between Lavrov and Rubio. Then they said it's going to be a phone call, and it seems everything is disappearing from the scene. And they're talking about new sanctions on Russia. And the Russian president came out and said, these sanctions, you're going to put these sanctions on us, but that's not going to influence that much Russia in order to change its behavior, or just to force Russia in something that Russia doesn't want. And here is what Donald Trump said about sanctions, Ambassador.
Putin basically said today that Russia is immune from U.S. sanctions. He said that it would not impact the Russian economy in any serious way. Is he
good.
wrong?
I'm glad he feels that way. That's good. I'll let you know about it in 6 months from now. Okay, let's see how it all works out.
It doesn't seem that he knows the reality of the Russian economy and the partnership between Russia, China, and the BRICS. And
no, he doesn't know. He does, but then he's not alone in that. The American press has, and the British press, have both misreported the condition of the Russian economy, so you hear stupid statements made about it. Russia is now the largest economy in Europe. It's overtaken Germany in size in terms of purchasing power, which is the only way to compare economies across borders. It is producing all of the military equipment that it requires. It's still, it's producing a large number of tanks. I just saw a stupid story that said the Russians couldn't produce tanks. Well, we can't produce tanks, but the Russians are producing them. So there's a lot of nonsense out there, and unfortunately, the president seems to get his information from Fox News rather than the $80 billion intelligence community that we fund. Now, I would say with regard to the oil sanctions on Russia, the Russian Federation, they will certainly have an effect. I think President Putin acknowledged that. But there will be workarounds. The two largest consumers of Russian oil are China, followed closely by India, they will find ways to continue to receive the oil that they need. So in the end, this is overreach by the United States and the European Union. And I continue to feel very surprised and disappointed that the Europeans have no vision for any kind of relationship with Russia other than one of war. What happens if Russia wins in Ukraine, which it probably will? That is, it succeeds in taking all of the Donbass and Odessa as well, and closes Ukraine off to the Black Sea. What are the Europeans going to do about that? There will be a rump Ukraine. Yes, the Russians don't want that part of Ukraine. But what are they going to do? What are they going to do in the meantime? So they have no plan, no peace offer, nothing. It's just more pressure. And we have seen again and again what policies of maximum pressure produce. That policy applied to North Korea resulted in North Korea building an ICBM with a nuclear warhead aimed at New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, and I hope not Exeter, New Hampshire, where I am, but you never know. And I think in the case of Iran, maximum pressure just adds to the pressure on the supreme leader to overcome religious scruples and accede to the widening requests of people in the Iranian establishment to build a bomb and to put it on an ICBM like North Korea did. So what is all this about? It is, we have seen again and again that maximum pressure doesn't work. It is counterproductive. There's no diplomacy going on. When Marco Rubio can't meet with Sergei Lavrov, we're right back to the Biden administration, which had no diplomatic approach at all, and which produced this war in Ukraine as a result of its unwillingness to confer with the Russians and the Ukrainians and other parties on a fair basis.
Since you've mentioned Iran, I forgot to ask you a question about Iran, because IAEA chief Rafael Grossi, he warned Iran that the failure of diplomacy with Iran could once again lead to the use of force against the country. And the response coming from the Iranian foreign minister was somehow diplomatic. He said, I don't know whether the language used by the IAEA director is meant as a threat or merely an expression of concern. But I think that was a threat. He's threatening. Is that common to use this sort of
no?
language?
And I think actually there's a lot of evidence that the IAEA, which is an independent agency of the United Nations, was effectively captured by both American and Israeli intelligence, and has been serving those the interests of American policy and Israeli policy. For example, many of the attempted assassinations that were carried out at the outset of the most recent attack on Iran seem to have been on the basis of information leaked from the IAEA. So Mr. Grossi is confirming, in effect, that he's biased, that he is not neutral, that he is not dealing with the issues on a fair basis, but is advancing an agenda that is anti-Iranian. So I suspect that Foreign Minister Arabchi doesn't have any interest in meeting with Mr. Grossi again. We'll see.
Every time Zelensky goes to Washington in the aftermath, you see he's going to the United Kingdom. And it seems that he's going there to just learn what would be the next step on their part to then decide about, the situation in Ukraine. Here is what Starmer ambassador said about long-range missiles to be sent to Ukraine.
Missiles, we've put in more missiles from the UK in recent days and weeks, and pushing the case for long range. It is really important that we do have long range, and those discussions are ongoing. And of course, the protection of energy, because Putin is attacking the energy in Ukraine, and that needs protection. We've had discussion today about how we can stop those attacks and how we can better protect those energy supplies.
Yeah.
There is, of course, Ukraine is attacking Russian energy, and Russia is attacking Ukrainian energy. And if the discussion about long-range missiles for Ukraine is a discussion between the UK and the United States, because the United States pulled back from providing a limited quantity of long-range Tomahawk missiles. The British are coming closer and closer to making themselves an overt belligerent in Ukraine and risking a Russian attack on them. You know, there's an interesting structural problem here. UK is a member of NATO, but it's no longer a member of the European Union. And most policy in Europe is now being made in the European Union, not NATO. The United States is less active in NATO, who basically have said, well, Europeans, you're responsible for dealing with Ukraine, we're not. We're happy to sell you weapons of certain kinds, not all, for Ukraine. So this is all very confused, and it's very interesting that Russophobia, which has been a phenomenon in British policy for over a century, continues. And again, the British, who are very clever people diplomatically, have put forward no proposals at all for peaceful coexistence with Russia under any circumstances, and have not addressed the Russian agenda, which begins with the neutralization of Ukraine, its non-membership in NATO, and the absence of foreign forces directed at Russia on its soil, and then goes to the rights of Russian and Hungarian and other minorities in Ukraine, and finally goes to an open discussion among Europeans, with Americans as well, on a security framework for Europe that threatens neither side, neither Russia nor Western Europeans. Nobody's put forward any proposals on this, except the Russians. They keep asking for discussion of these issues and getting no response. So this is not very impressive. And I think the Starmer government is now very much on borrowed time domestically. It has minimal support. And it has, in the eyes of many people in Britain, disgraced itself with its handling of the Israeli football fans from Maccabi, when the local government in Britain, on safety grounds, banned the Maccabi fans. Starmer took the side of Israel against his own people's safety. So he's basically arguing that Israelis should have the right to come and break things, riot, and chant death to the Arabs and other genocidal things in Britain with impunity. So Britain is still engaged in protecting Israel from the consequences of its own actions, and it's doing the same with Ukraine. And of course, Britain has always been a major force advising American policy. The connections are very close, even if we speak different kinds of English. They rather like Brazil and Portugal, but George Bernard Shaw described us as two countries divided by a common language. Anyway, we are very close to the British, and and pay a lot of attention to them with good reason. They are clever, but they're not being clever now. And I don't know where they're going to end up. I feel sorry for Ukraine, because Ukraine would benefit greatly by making peace, not fiddling around with ceasefires and long-range attacks on Russia, which will simply lead to counter-escalation by the Russians.
Actually, in the latest visit of NATO Secretary General, he was next to Donald Trump in, in the White House. He was asked about. It seems that the new polls show that 23% of Ukrainians or somehow agree with the continuation of the war in Ukraine. He said, if that's the case, why are you pushing for more war with Russia? Because Ukrainians don't want Ukrainian people don't want to go to war anymore.
Well, they have been used from the beginning. They have been used as an instrument to punish Russia, and people forget, before the coup d'état in 2014, Ukrainians were overwhelmingly opposed to joining NATO. It took a lot of money and effort by American institutions and British institutions to turn that around and install a government with popular support for joining NATO. That popular support for joining NATO is the cause of the war. And it's not surprising that it is evaporating. So we have a divide. We've always had a divide in Ukraine between the ultranationalist element and ordinary Ukrainians, and it's now quite sharp. So 23% of Ukrainians want to fight on. They're mostly in Western Ukraine, pretty far from the battlefield, and they're quite passionate in their anti-Russian attitudes. Others, less so. I mean, I suppose that even Russian-speaking Ukrainians have been turned against Russia by the war, but they have not become followers of the Nazi element in the west of Ukraine.
You mentioned how the United Kingdom is close to the United States, but the other country that is close to the United States because of the language is Canada. Physically, at least, is closer to the United States. And it seems the government in Canada, they have published an ad in which shows, they mention in some of the words of Reagan, considering tariffs, and which wasn't that much, resonating with Donald Trump. He said that's fake. That doesn't make sense. He didn't say that. Here is the main clip that they used for that ad that they have produced. Here is Reagan.
World, there's a growing realization that the way to prosperity for all nations is rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair and free competition. Now, there are sound historical reasons for this. For those of us who lived through the Great Depression, the memory of the suffering it caused is deep and searing. And today, many economic analysts and historians argue that high tariff legislation passed back in that period, called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, greatly deepened the Depression and prevented economic recovery. You see, at first, when someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. What eventually occurs is, first, homegrown industries start relying on government protection in the form of high tariffs. They stop.
Yeah, the ad based on this clip caused the United States to end, the trade talks between.
But I think, Nima, it's important to recognize that it wasn't the Canadian government that did this. It was the government of Ontario. Canada is a very loose confederation. In fact, there's some danger. There's a lot of separatist sentiment, particularly in places like Manitoba and Saskatchewan in the West, who believe they believe they've been treated unfairly by Ontario and the Canadians in the East, and they're not very comfortable with the Quebec autonomy in the confederation. But having said that, first of all, Ronald Reagan made a lot of sense. What he said is true. I think most economists agree with him. You would find only one, Peter Navarro, who doesn't agree with him. And it is certainly an overreaction, a ridiculous tantrum by President Trump to object to this advertisement. Are we do we have a dictatorship and we're now our government is immune from criticism and criticism by people who, as you point out, are very closely related to us. I have relatives in the maritime provinces, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, in Canada, because they were on the losing side of our Revolutionary War, and they left what is now the United States to take refuge in British Canada. So there's a lot of history here, and I think it's a great shame that we are gratuitously alienating a kindred people who, in many ways, are very admirable. So if I were able to speak for the United States, I would apologize to the Canadians.
Because the Prime Minister of Canada said that they're finding new partners. They're improving the relationship with the new partners, which means China. Massive deals would take place between the two, between Canada and the United States. I don't know if Donald Trump considers that as an issue for him and for the economy of the United States.
It's very hard to understand what he thinks on this. I mean, the tariffs on Canada have been absurd from the beginning. We had a very successfully integrated automobile industry, for example. That is now basically in the process of being destroyed. The Canadians have been driven to seek a bilateral cooperative agreement with Mexico, which is the United States' largest trading partner. As I said, they're now focused on building ties to the East, to Europe and the Middle East and Africa. And they will continue to build ties with Latin America, bypassing the United States. And in the end, I think they will have to reach out to China because when you look at global economies, in purchasing power terms, China is probably 1.5 times the size of the American economy, and it's very open. China is busily negotiating free trade agreements. So if Canada decides not to follow the American lead, I think the Chinese would be receptive to an approach by them. So I think that what the Trump administration is doing is isolating the United States, creating enemies, not friends, destroying friendships for no gain, doing it in a peculiarly childish manner.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Well, I hope the world will get better so we have better things to talk about.
Exactly. Thank you.